We chose 4 of the 12 contributions and asked the authors to say something for 5 minutes each about their contribution. Of course, we would have liked to give 5 minutes to all the contributors, but it would have gone on for more than an hour. So we just thought we'll take a sample. We do have at least half of the contributors here today. I see also Miri Freud-Kandel, who I haven't met personally. Welcome. Peter Bowler is here. Udi Greenberg is here, and Vlad Naumescu is here. And if there's someone else here, you can say hello in the course of the presentation today. So following the 4 overviews of 4 different chapters, and we chose these just to show the geographic sort of scope of the project. It's not about preferred chapters or something of the sort. Following those 4 chapter introductions, we're going to have a discussion in which we want to hear from the other contributors, and we also would like to open the floor up to questions from you, comments, and so on. So again, thank you very much for coming. The book originated as a conference which Benjamin Simon, who is here today, and I initiated, and then Hugh MacLeod joined us. This was a 2017 conference in London, sponsored by the British Academy, and the book with Oxford University Press is part of the series Proceedings of the British Academy. So we're very grateful to the British Academy for the support, and also to Oxford University Press. They've done a wonderful job editing the book and helping us, bring it along. So I think it's a lovely product in the end, and we're very excited about it. Just to show you the cover illustration, we didn't know what to choose. We chose something at the very beginning of the 20th century, which is a postcard from the French separation of church and state of 1905. And there you see Marianne, the proud republic, shooing the Catholic Church out of the public realm. That's the so-called laïcité of France. And that's one of the events that sets the stage for the type of dynamics between religious and secular actors that we are examining in the book. Has Hugh appeared? Does anyone? No. Okay. Then I will just seamlessly take over and tell you a little bit about the overview. So when we started this project as the British Academy Conference, we were interested in trying to bring together diverse literatures, historical literatures. There's been a lot written on religion and the Cold War, for instance. There's a certain amount on interwar politics and religion. But we felt that there hadn't yet been a proper treatment of 20th century religious history, which delved into the political aspects of religion. So the conference was aimed to bring together scholars working in different times, different places, to sort of bridge some of these differing literatures. We've also seen more literature, say, on Eastern Europe separate from Western Europe, and so on. So we did find, I think, in the course of working on the book, we came to some conclusions about what makes this period particular. We talk about the short 20th century as the 20th century of between the establishment of the Soviet Union in 1917 and the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, if you look at that period and you look at religious politics, you find that it's really only in this period that there's an existential threat to religions. Certainly, if you look at regimes like in the Soviet Union, China, also Mexico and Spain, it's really in this time frame of the short 20th century that we see a massive anti-clerical action sponsored by states in a way that we hadn't seen before. So we also noted that at the center, really, of 20th century religious politics, secularism and secular movements always appear, even if it's disputes within religions or between religions. The presence of secularism makes itself felt. So we thought it was important to look both at religious competition between what we think of as religions, and secularism. And that is essentially the field that we wanted to explore in this book. We decided to introduce the term apologetics as a key term that would hopefully allow us to do some comparative work and overcome some of the conceptual difficulties that we face when we look at religion and politics. So essentially, the idea was that when people write about religion or about secular politics, they find it difficult to sort of find a conceptual vocabulary that allows these two spheres to be examined at the same time in their own terms. So often people when they look at the political realm, they may look at the religious motivations of political actors. When they look at politics in the form of ideologies, they talk about political religions, and vice versa. When people in the field of religion write about politics, they are usually trying to translate political terms into the religious realm. So we thought that with the idea of, Hugh, you did manage to join? Hugh, are you there? Can you turn on your microphone?
Cross that out. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, I think
so. We've already made a start. I introduced the book. I started to speak in general about aspects of the short 20th century. If you wanted to take over, then I'd let you add your views on the relevance of the book for 20th century history, and then I could come back and fill in a bit with apologetics.
Okay, I'll add a few words. Well, as Todd's already said, we've concentrated on the so-called short 20th century. We see it as a period of intense religious competition, and that's the key point which we're trying to highlight in the book. And we feel that also this is true of all parts of the world. So it's not just a book about Europe or about America or about Asia. It's relevant to all three. We prefer this framework of competition between the various religions, and between religions and secularist groups, and between secularizing political movements, to familiar frames such as secularization or modernization, in which we see religions faced with an inexorable process, which they're really helpless to resist, for instance, in Hobsbawm's Age of Extremes. Or another, I think, also faulty framework is that used by some sociologists of religion, such as Peter Berger, where it's essentially a difference between Europe, which for deep historical reasons is highly secular, and the rest of the world, which is highly religious. In the first place, we don't think that Europe is quite as secular as this, or that the rest of the world is quite as religious. And this whole approach tends to miss out the interaction between the religious and the secular, which is the theme of many of our papers. Two events or processes are of vital significance for this history. First, obviously, the Bolshevik Revolution, the pivotal event of the 20th century, and it's with the final collapse of the Soviet Union that we end our period. But second, although it plays a less big part in the book, the European colonial empires and the legacies which they left in the 20th century, including, among other things, the Christianization of large parts of the world and the complexities in the religious situation in countries such as India and many others, which resulted from that. So we divide the book into three periods. The first, the 1920s and 30s, in which we see, on the whole, uncompromising opposition between the religious forces, as exemplified, for instance, in our chapter on Catholic Action by John Pollard, and on the other hand, the Soviet religious policies, which have an enormous impact in other countries, both in inspiring some and also in offering an awful example to others, and were a gift to conservative political parties in other parts of Europe. Secondly, the Cold War, which became in many ways a religious war, featured again in two of our chapters, covering Billy Graham and also anti-communists in the United States who were former anti-Catholics. The Cold War became a religious war with the Americans apparently as leaders of the Christian world. Although we can see at the same time the development of colonial nationalist movements, which complicate the situation by sometimes requiring an alliance between secular and religious nationalists. We also see the beginnings of the non-aligned movement. And our third period, when the boundaries start getting much more blurred, is that beginning with the 1960s. They get blurred partly because of the current vogue for dialogue, exemplified both by Vatican II and by the World Council of Churches, and by such things as Christian Marxist dialogues. We also, in our book, find the example of the Indian Orthodox Church as described by Vlad Numesco, which seeks to move beyond the simple opposition between the communist world and the so-called free world, and adopting an approach which is traditional in theology, but progressive in politics. We also see other moves towards dialogue within religious movements in the forms of more theological dialogue. Miri Freud-Candle's chapter on debates within Judaism focuses on the Rabbi Louis Jacobs, who wanted to, in some ways, modify traditional versions of orthodoxy, leading to enormous conflict within Orthodox Judaism, or Peter Eatson's chapter on the Church of England, showing how the Anglican Church attempted to make concessions to new, ostensibly secularizing ideas in their bids to retain an influence on the form which reforms took. We also see in this period the such things as the Moroccan communists adapting to the overriding presence of Islam by dropping their atheism, as shown by Alma Rachel Heckman, or Billy Graham sidelining his traditional anti-communism, as shown in Uta Balbir's paper on Billy Graham. Meanwhile, we see the religious context changing in important ways in the later part of the 20th century, partly because of rapid secularization in the West, but as a result of social and cultural change rather than the appeal of communism. Partly because of religious revival in the communist world, often linked with nationalism, and partly because of the Iranian Revolution and the growing presence on both sides of the Cold War divide of a fear of Islamic militancy. So we see a new kind of political religious situation setting in the later decades of the century, where the old conflicts in which class conflict was a crucial issue giving way to the growing salience on the one hand of national identities and secondly of questions of individual rights. So we see national identities very frequently fused with religious identities, often in an exclusive way. Thus we see, for instance, in Vlad Misko's chapter on India, Christians who'd cooperated with other religious groups against communists in the 50s, now seeing Hindu nationalists as being a greater danger. Meanwhile, debates over individual rights have often pitted secularists against conservative believers, with liberal believers stuck uncomfortably somewhere in the middle. The issues and fields of contact change, but competition between religions and between religions and secularism has remained a central political issue in most parts of the world. And that's where I'll conclude and pass back to Todd.
Thank you, Hugh. So I just wanted to mention briefly this idea of apologetics, because, well, my chapter deals extensively with it, but in our introduction as well, we do a conceptual history of the term. The reason that we find it appealing is that, as I was starting to say before, I think that religious studies scholars, historians sometimes have trouble finding the right conceptual language to talk about how religion interacts with the secular. And the appeal of apologetics is that we have a tradition that comes out of the Christian churches of a very sophisticated examination of how the churches see the outside, see the secular, see other religious, understand religious competition. They do it within the framework of apologetics. And apologetics is both then a theory from within the churches of how they interact with the outside, but it's also a location in the church where you have specialists in defending the church who are often the same persons that are developing new theological ideas in the competition. And what we just thought was that if we could take the term apologetics and secularize it, so to speak, neutralize it, and use it also for the other side of conflicts over religion and politics. Could we, for instance, apply it to Muslim individuals, organizations that are defending the Muslim faith against, say, Christian incursions? Would it also work, for example, with communists? Do the communists have have apologists as well? And so we were suggesting that, yes, you could neutralize it, you can use it. It helps demarcate a very narrow zone of conflict and interaction. And we find specialists on both sides of secular religious conflicts that are engaged with a set of often shared concepts. In the chapter that I developed, I looked at the term worldview or Weltanschauung, and that was a key term used both by secular and religious apologists in the Weimar period. And we were hoping that with the idea of apologetics, we could also do comparisons across the century and across religions. So I will leave it at that. And we wanted to turn now to 4 of the chapters and ask the authors to just give us an introduction to their chapter, maybe talk about something that they learned in the process of writing it. Did apologetics work or not? It's up to the contributor what they want to say. And we're going to follow roughly the order in the book. So I'll ask Benjamin Simon to start off, then Uta Balbier, followed by Victoria Smolkin, and then Clemens Six. And then after that, we will open it for discussion with the other contributors. And again, the other contributors who are present today are, I think, Vlad Naumescu has appeared, Miri Freud-Kandel, Udi Greenberg, and Peter Bowler. So Benjamin, would you like to take over?
Yes, thanks, Todd, and you. Well, in my case, it actually makes sense to use apologetics. Mine is a biographical example. I've written a biography of Martin Niemöller, born 1892, died in 1984, who is well known as the Protestant pastor from the parish community in Berlin-Dahlem, which is a suburb of Berlin, who then basically very quickly after also in 1933 already started what was later to become the Confessing Church, and became its figurehead in their fight against the German Christians, which is the Nazi faction in the Protestant churches in Germany, which, I mean, the German Christians who seized control of the Protestant churches early on, not in all of them, but in many of them, including the Prussian one in which Niemöller was working. And I mean, long story short, after lots of struggles, what is usually known as the church struggle, Niemöller was detained in 1938 and then kept as Hitler's personal prisoner in a concentration camp, first Sachsenhausen, then Dachau, until 1945, point of liberation. And obviously the story how it then evolves is that he became this famous, world famous, in fact, I mean, since his years in Sachsenhausen, moral authority who could speak authoritatively for reconciliation, peace, and ecumenical work in the post-1945 period. What I've done is, so this is the standard story, but using that device of apologetics, as Todd explains, a more complicated picture emerges. And first of all, I make three brief points. The first point is that actually Niemöller, who is known as somebody who fights against the German Christians, actually shared an apologetic front with them against the so-called godless people, which is the socialist/communist freethinkers in Germany. And that included actually physically sharing a platform with local, I mean, parish members of the German Christians, even during the summer of 1933, while he already confronted the German Christians on other aspects of church policy. The second important finding or insight is then the years of solitary confinement in Sachsenhausen. I'm not talking at length here about then the other side of this, which is sort of his apologetics against the Völkisch perversion of Christianity and the Protestant faith. The second point is the solitary confinement in Sachsenhausen, where Niemöller discovered elements of Catholic piety which provided comfort to him, and then developed a sustained engagement with the Catholic tradition, and actually planned to convert, a plan that he only aborted at the beginning of 1941. This is usually seen as some kind of cabin fever, so he got a little bit mad in isolation, and that's got him got him distracted from the real Protestant cause, but actually had very serious ecclesiological reasons, which also prompted him to write a book, which I've edited with the Protestant theologian in 2019, probably the only book that was ever written in a German concentration camp, to my knowledge. And the key point to all of this is that the traditional way of defending the Protestant faith, I mean, Protestant apologetics, had fundamentally failed and in fact collapsed in his view. And the starting point for his reflections is not only that the infighting that had been going on within the Protestant churches between the Confessing Church and the German Christians, but then also, and perhaps more importantly, the infighting that had commenced very early on between the different wings within the Confessing Church, of which he was the key representative, obviously, of what is called the Dahlemite wing, so the more radical wing, which was against any accommodation with the German Christians. And ultimately, and that's the final straw, really, which then also prompted him to write a letter in which he declared, I will now I leave the Protestant Landeskirche, the territorial church, is that these Landeskirchen, the territorial churches, were in fact nothing but an empty bureaucratic shell, something that Niemöller at that point, writing in 1939, took as indicative that actually the whole Lutheran tradition since the 16th century had fundamentally gone wrong, because there were churches which were devoid of any theological engagement, which had in fact sold out back then in the 16th century and again in the Third Reich to the secular ruler. Well, he recovered on that episode, basically pushed by his wife, Else, who feared he might become a Catholic priest and then she would lose her husband. But I think this is more than just the biographical thing and his thing, because his example was obviously important, and the news of his planned conversion leaked. There were covered in the New York Times and in the London Times. The New York Times reported he has already converted, and it prompted a lot of soul searching, not only in his own parish, but also across Germany, and a whole load of other theological debates, which I can't look into. And the third point then is trying to make sense that post 1945, he actually reverted back to form, to his aggressive anti-Catholicism, which had been the mainstay of Protestant culture in Germany since the culture wars of the Kulturkampf era in the late 19th century. So to sum up, what this shows, in my view, is that the religious field in the Third Reich is actually much more complicated than usually assumed, and that it disrupts conventional linear narratives of church history and religious evolution. The two important ones are here: the secularization narrative, although there is a bit of it in it, but I have to leave that out now. More importantly, though, that of the confessionalization narrative, or that of the second confessional age, which is so crucial, according to some historians, for understanding what is going on in German church history. With his book that he wrote in only 3 months in 1939, and many texts that had been published prior to that, the Third Reich is, in my view, the age of Bekenntnisse, confessions. There were all these short texts that were hammered out, particularly in 1933, 1934, that were laying out key principles of Protestant belief systems and trying to defend and shore positions that were, constantly in flux. And in that sense, in my view, the Third Reich is, in terms of religious history, I think, well described as the age of apologetics.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. So Benjamin Ziemann is professor of history at the University of Sheffield, and we're now going to hear from Ute Balbier, who is are you senior lecturer, professor?
Yes, senior lecturer.
At King's College in London.
So first of all, thanks again to you and Todd and also Benedict for including me into this intellectual adventure. In my chapter, I focused on Billy Graham's revival work of the 1950s in the US and in the UK. And this concept of Christian apologetics invited me to think about the competition which shapes Billy Graham's preaching between, on the one hand, it's directed against communism, but it is also, of course, shaped by giving Christianity a new voice in an increasingly secular surrounding. So American evangelist Billy Graham rose to stardom in 1949 in the United States at a crusade in Los Angeles, several week-long revival meeting. But when you read contemporary press reports of the 1950s, they all agree what made Billy Graham into this world-leading, globally respected evangelist was actually a revival meeting which took place in London in 1954 at Haringey Arena, where he preached for 12 weeks. He packed the stadium, the arena every single night, and he basically spoke to 2 million people while in London. So the question that was driving my chapter is what is the specific message that Billy Graham is preaching on both sides of the Atlantic, which appeals to such different religious and political audiences? And what I really learned while I wrote the chapter is to get a more distinct understanding of what are the different ingredients of this preaching which works so well. So we're having a time of perceived secularization at the beginning of the 1950s, meaning that the Holocaust, the Second World War, the dropping of the atomic bomb, all this by people of faith is perceived as Christianity kind of losing its impact on society, losing its ability to shape public values. And in response to that, this young evangelist comes up with a message that makes a very complex counteroffer to this secular political culture. And it is combined of four specific aspects I show in this chapter. And the one really important strain of Billy Graham's preaching is that he turns Christianity rhetorically into a guarantee for democracy. As a counteroffer to communism, he turns Christianity into a guarantee for prosperity. Of course, also as a counteroffer to communism, but he is also selling Christianity as a guarantee for social stability at a time of important transformations in both societies. We see the rise of the civil rights movement in the United States, but we also see increased immigration in the United Kingdom. This raises really, really important questions about the identity of these societies, and Billy Graham is there to give the answers in a particular rhetoric, which again and again blends the religious and the secular, the sacred and the profane. And the fourth ingredient of this specific rhetoric that we see at this particular point in time is the way in which Billy Graham sells Christianity as a form of legitimacy to America and the UK, both at a time of questioning their future role in the world. So to just give you an example from this kind of rhetoric. So in LA, for example, Graham is saying, to safeguard our democracy, preserve the better way of life, we must have a revival of genuine old-fashioned Christianity. That is what he's preaching in the US. In London, he is preaching God is allowing Great Britain and the United States to enjoy the greatest prosperity of our history. Never before have so many had so much through the very goodness of God. So this is a rhetoric which shifts constantly between the political and the religious and the secular and the religious. The main point I realized while I wrote this chapter is that I tend to read this specific thinking, this version of Christianity, as a product of the Cold War. But when I looked at the specific ways in which Billy Graham addresses the future role of world leadership in the United States, in the UK, in the United Kingdom, I realized that this is not just about the Cold War. This is about the beginning of the century, and it is also about the at least feared end of the British Empire. And when I looked specifically at how he preached about the United Kingdom and its future role in the world in London, it was really striking to see the many references he made to the greatness of the British past and how much the country has given to the world. He preached at Trafalgar Square. He put himself visibly at the heart of the British Empire, and he again and again referred to the United States and the United Kingdom at this particular point in time as inseparably linked. In the political sphere, we call it the beginning of the special relationship. What Billy Graham is offering to the British at this particular point in time is a leadership of the Christian world, a joint leadership between the United States and the United Kingdom. So in short, what I learned while writing this chapter is a clearer understanding of the different layers of Graham's re-Christianization rhetoric, which constantly blended Christianity with a commitment to democracy, guarantee for prosperity, a conservative kit at times of social change, and as a source of legitimacy for world leadership. And while the inauguration is going on in the background, of course, he revives the Christian nationalism, which brought the president into office, which we saw leave earlier today.
Thank you so much, Uta. So next we'll hear from Victoria Smolkin, who's professor of history at Wesleyan University. You have to turn your mic on.
It's amazing you still managed to do this after all these months on Zoom. Well, I was expressing my gratitude to our editors, to Todd and Hugh, who convened us in what turned out to be a really fascinating conference and conversation to talk about these questions in a new way. So I'll just say a few words about my contribution and pause at the end on some of the insights that I think it can offer and what I've learned. So I'm an historian of the Soviet Union and Russia, and a good portion of my research has been devoted to Soviet atheism, which, of course, as Hugh noted earlier in his introduction, was I think the way that it was put was an inspiration for some, a warning for others. and really a kind of, in my view, a specter that has haunted secularism from its inception. You know, this kind of how to distinguish secularism from this kind of Soviet atheism as a kind of external force in power. So what I did to kind of get at this question of apologetics in the Soviet Union was to look at this very particular and in some ways peculiar figure type, which is the figure of the religious apostate turned atheist apologist, or atheist propagandist, professional atheist. And the reason I think that this figure is particularly interesting and revealing to us is because in a place where atheism is in power, there isn't a kind of space for apologetics, right? The party has a monopoly on the public sphere and the kinds of conversations that can happen in the public sphere. So rather than a dialogue, what you have is a kind of monologue, right? That is happening by figures who have ostensibly come to our side, right? So people who were in the church who have come over to atheism, and they are now doing kind of both parts of the dialogue, right? They're explaining the religious side and the atheist side, and kind of going through the kind of apologetic kind of moves of both parties. So I focus on two of the most famous of these apostates who become prominent and professional atheists, and they're two of the most prominent and those who left the kind of made the biggest impact and left the biggest records, but they were part of a broader phenomenon, which roughly, you know, they say there are around 200 of these priests from the Russian Orthodox Church who left at around this time. So, and the point, I guess, one of the points that I want to kind of highlight here is that this time is the Khrushchev era, which is really key to this moment, to this story. This happens under Khrushchev, and the question that I kind of tried to look at in the article was, why now? Why in this moment? And the answer that I put forward is that Stalin's death created the opportunity and the need to not just kind of more broadly redefine communism, which is a story that I think everybody kind of knows in general, but to also kind of redefine the party's position on religion in the Soviet Union, especially because Stalin had himself reversed his position on religion, bringing religion back into, to some degree, back into the state, kind of making this concordat with the Russian Orthodox Church during the war, and in a way kind of creating a new space for religion to actually proliferate quietly in the post-war period. So they come into, the party comes into the Khrushchev era having to kind of redefine itself, and it redefines itself on this platform of building communism. And one of the key shifts that it makes is to redefine the front in the battle against religion from a kind of repressive, violent strategy of arresting, sending to the gulag, closing churches, and so on, to shifting into this apologetic mode where the battle becomes ideological, right? And so this idea that the battlefront against religion is no longer a battle against church and believer, right, as enemies, but against ideologies, right, against the kind of worldviews that become the kind of the opponents, and therefore, you know, the kind of recourse to violence and repression is no longer a kind of viable political strategy in the post-Stalin era, right? So it kind of makes apologetics a new and valuable tool. So that's the kind of why now. Why them? Why these apostates, right? Why these kind of former clergy that become these you know, kind of a prominent part of the atheist apparatus? Well, I argue in the article for two reasons. One is because they have for the parties two audiences, which are on the one hand religious believers who they want to convert, and on the other hand atheists who they need to train because they have no religious literacy. So these two apostates and the kind of this figure plays a key function. For the believers, they seem authentic, right? They are one of them, and they communicate in a kind of literate and sincere, seemingly sincere way why one should leave religion and, you know, come over to the other side. And they narrate this in a way that is familiar and seems true and authentic and accessible. For the atheist apparatus, which is just beginning to form at this time in a coherent and kind of institutional way, they become, they're valuable because of their religious literacy, right? Because in this moment when they kind of take up this new campaign against religion, there are no actual individuals who have the religious literacy to conduct this kind of apologetic struggle against religion, because this struggle has been in a way kind of a kind of a taboo topic in the public sphere, and nobody has been learning atheist kind of apologetics in the decades leading up to this. So the kind of, they play this function for these two audiences. And then finally, why do they matter? Well, I think two reasons. One of the reasons I wanted to tell this story is kind of aimed at the non-specialist audience, meaning not those who are not familiar with the Russian and Soviet case in particular. Because as I said, this kind of idea of the Soviet Union or Soviet atheism as a specter that kind of haunts this project from a distance. What I wanted to show is that actually behind that kind of specter, behind that seeming kind of monolith of atheistic communism, there's actually, it's actually a kind of a lot of ad hoc kind of responses to very specific problems. And actually, they're not working with a great deal of expertise, and they're not actually working with a great deal of manpower on the ground, right? So they don't have the knowledge and they don't have the cadres, and yet this kind of, you know, boogeyman is being projected to the outside world. So one of the things I wanted to show in this broader conversation about apologetics was, you know, that they're turning to former priests to kind of do this work because there are no other people who are capable of doing it in that way at the time. And so that's one.
We need to, if you could wrap it up, because
yeah, that's the last point.
That was it?
No,
Okay.
the last point is just this, the point about why it's interesting internally is that they adapted these apologetic strategies as a result of their engagements, so that on the one hand, they began to see the criticism of religion as one kind of direction, and on the other hand, the propagation of atheism in a positive sense as something separate. So they, for the first time, began to see these projects as actually two distinct fields, two distinct battlegrounds, which in fact then transformed Soviet atheism internally for the rest of the Soviet period. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so our fourth speaker is Clemens Six, who's professor in history here in the University of Groningen. And try to keep it to 5 minutes, Clemens, because no one else managed. I think I didn't manage, and everyone else. But we do want to leave some time for discussion at the end. So, and if people want to stay on past 6 to stay in the discussion, of course, that's open. So go ahead, Clemens.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I have the feeling that a lot has been said already. There's a lot of input for everyone listening to this kind of discussion. So I try to be even more ambitious and stay below 5 minutes. The question, you know, there has been, the 3 presentations that we had now were all on, you know, Germany, US, UK, and Russia. So this is all what we could say Western history. My question was, can we use this concept of apologetics that comes from a very distinct background, a Christian, European philosophical background? Can we apply, and should we apply this concept to understand developments in late colonial, early post-colonial societies in Asia, in my case? So, and what do we get out of this? That was basically the question that I tried to address. I looked into this context of decolonization. Why decolonization? Well, because if you want to understand the 20th century, I think decolonization is one of the most important processes that this century has brought about. And it's, decolonization is a big process of reshuffling power relations, of, evolving nation building and transforming statehood. So I thought if we can see the relevance of apologetics in this particular context, then we have shown that it is indeed worth the effort to play a bit with this concept to understand 20th century world history in more general terms. Monica Wohlrab-Saar, in her afterword in the book, has used a very nice term to describe what apologetics indicates. Namely, it's a sort of a seismograph for political and socioeconomic and cultural transformations in a society. And I think this is exactly how I try to use it in this context of decolonization. Now, what are the results of my investigation? I've looked into 3 different, not individuals or biographies, but 3 different movements in 3 different societies in South and Southeast Asia. A Christian missionary network, a Hindu nationalist organization, and a Muslim organization. And then I've tried to compare how they defended their faiths, their religious commitments in the context of decolonization. And I came up with 3 different types of apologetics that I think we could distinguish when we look at it from a global historical perspective. One is a transnational form of apologetics. I find that apologetics in word as well as deed is a result of trans-imperial and transnational exchanges and flows. So these religious organizations are exposed to and react to trans-imperial forms of influence and entanglements that I think are important to understand how their specific forms of apologetics have evolved over time. A second type that I found is I called national majoritarian apologetics, so where organizations are speaking in the name of national religious majorities and try to defend these national majorities against either the secular state, who threatens a certain religious character of a society, in their view at least, and or against religious minorities who are undermining a national majoritarian religious mainstream. And the third type of apologetics that I found I called national adaptive. This is a form of apologetics that is basically accepting the secular state as a superior overall framework for religion and religious organizations. But through a certain form of apologetics, these organizations try to maximize their freedom and autonomy within the confines of a secular modern state. These are basically my findings. And and I see all 3 forms of apologetics are very, very contemporary. I see them also in the post-2000s societies in Asia. And I think this is a quite interesting way to understand how global conditions for faith and for religion has changed throughout the 20th century. So I was honestly, at the end of writing this chapter, I was more convinced about apologetics as a concept of 20th century world history than I was when I started. So it was a pretty interesting encounter. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Clemens. So these 4 presentations give you a bit of a sense of the scope of the book. But we should really have all 13 contributions. Is that how many we have? But of course, we don't have time for that. I put in the chat, if anybody wants to purchase the book, you can have a discount if you use, there's a code there from Oxford that they gave us to hand out. So if anyone would like a copy, you can order it from Oxford with that code. I'd like to just open it now for discussion. I don't want to have questions necessarily to the presenters, but rather maybe some of the other contributors want to sort of chip in, maybe not summarizing what they did, but telling us, what they learned from the comparisons, or giving some insight into what does apologetics tell us about these familiar problems of religious conflict, of secularism, religious developments, history of ideas. So I'll just open the floor and see where it takes us. But I would like to hear from some other people who haven't had a chance to say anything yet. You can just jump in or raise your hand, either way. I can also ask you questions if you want.
I think Vlad wanted to say something. Todd?
Okay.
I see Vlad's hand up.
Go, Vlad, can you jump in there, please? Introduce yourself and then, is your mic on? Sometimes the people have trouble with the software. There is your.
Yeah, so sorry, Todd.
Okay.
My computer doesn't survive a day of teaching, a full day of being online. Is it okay now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I decided to step in simply because I can only I can follow up on Clemens. I was really happy to read his text, in the final form and see how much it connects with mine. And I can only say that my case study on the Syrian Christians in Kerala, Syrian Orthodox Church in Kerala, fits very well type 1 and type 3 of his apologetics. But so it's both, in a sense, it's a great example of a transnational, the transnational flow of secular and religious tools and language, political language, vocabulary at the time, both in the colonial, like decolonizing in the post-colonial context, and the Cold War, and at the same time, it talks very nicely to the national kind of post-independence Indian context, with attempts to create a secular state, yet having both the Hindu nationalists and the Kerala communists pushing back. And I thought, I started very differently. Rather than starting from apologetics, as you remember very well in the conference, I started from a case that fascinated me, which was this small church peripheral to global Christianity and to the whole Cold War, and a peripheral kind of local priest journalist who turns out to become Haile Selassie's counselor, then president of the World Council of Churches for 3 times, and manages to push this Oriental Orthodox alliance in the middle of Cold War politics and also the ecumenical movement. So kind of pushing back at both and appropriating the language of ecumenism and fighting with it against the normative there, the ideology that it promotes, and also appropriating the language of Cold War politics and trying to push back from there. And it all comes out very nicely in this project that they created, an Oriental a Sunday school curriculum for Oriental churches, which I see, and it fits very nicely with Clemens's observation, basically a place where youth education, schools and youth education becomes a field of apologetic struggle. And I place that both in the Cold War context and in the post-colonial context. And and it illustrates, I think it makes a very nice illustration of how you can use apologetics to observe, not just secular and religious struggles, but also the way these develop across time and space. And the only thing I added to that, in a sense, is that based on the experience, since I've been working on these Indian churches and Sunday school and religious education since 19th century, as an anthropologist, this hasn't been an easy project. I also answering the question why now, kind of, and why education. I also thought that it's actually the way they put this to work is more than a kind of it's more than related to the apologetic struggle, because for them it's also a way for reform, and religious and political reform, and this has been how they used it both at the level of Kerala, of the state, at the national level, and global kind of religious politics. And that's what I learned this throughout this process. It was really an excellent learning process for me, to deal with historical materials and to work with this within this frame. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity.
Great, thank you, Vlad. Vlad Namescu is a professor of anthropology at Central European University. So I'd mentioned that as well. Others who would like to say something? We're coming up on an hour. Feel free to leave if you have to leave, but I think it's nice to continue the discussion for another 15 minutes for whoever would like to stay.
I think Mick has raised his hand.
Yes, that's me. That's Monica.
Oh, right.
That goes back for ages that I chose this name for specific reasons. Sorry that I cannot show my picture. My computer collapsed several times when I put on the camera, so I had to leave it out. I would like to actually to ask a question to both you and Todd, and now relating back to what has already been said. What I find interesting in this topic of apologetics is that it goes beyond like single cases, that it addresses a certain genre of communication in the political realm, that it addresses the perception of a social transformation. Clemens has said that it addresses a perception of social change that is perceived negatively, and it tries to defend something that is felt to be under threat. And so I think it's an interesting perspective, like on a middle range of social analysis, to research transformation processes and their perceptions and the way to relate certain societal actors relate to them. And I would like to ask the two of you if you could imagine, like, is there a possible research agenda that now goes beyond the individual cases, where this topic or this issue of apologetics could be addressed like in a systematic, broader perspective?
Thank you, Monica. That's Monica Vohra-Psar from the University of Leipzig, who wrote an afterword for the book. It's an intriguing question. How would one approach it in a systematic fashion? One could certainly, do more direct comparisons between apologetic organizations. I tried to do a bit of that in my chapter, but I don't know how one would, create a larger, more systematic examination. Does Hugh or anyone else have an idea of?
Well, I think in order to think in such a direction, I mean, it's just like a fantasy. I don't know if it makes sense, yeah. But in order to think in such a direction, I think you have like gathered quite a lot of material in all the projects that have worked in that direction, and one should think of how does apologetics, how is it different from other forms of social critique? Because it is a sort of social critique. What does it teach us beyond like a study that would address different types of, let's say, conservative social critique or defensive social critique? do we find apologetics also like in the present populist movements that we find in many places in the world? And I would say so. There is an apologetics of a certain culture that is felt to be under threat. So is it something that you could imagine linking up with what has been done so far?
I think the aspect of it is, I have to admit, I haven't thought about how to do a systematic study. I think the aspect of it which I'm most interested in a way is that there's always an internal audience as much as an external audience, and in fact even more than an internal audience, that you'd be sure that other people within your own movement or church or political party will be listening, and that probably many of them will hate what you're saying. So you're trying to convince them, or at least score points off them as much as you are any external audience who may not actually take a great interest. I think that's actually brought out quite a bit in what Todd wrote in the book about apologetics, that particularly in the case of the Protestant church in Germany, for instance, it was often as much a battle between liberal and conservative Protestants as between Protestants and outsiders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what I found useful from your conclusion, Monica, was this, as you said, this sort of middle range activity, right, between individuals and larger structures, and that the apologetics helps us identify, for instance, Vlad was just talking about education, so we have individual biographies being used to try to convert people as an apologetic activity, but we also have educational institutions. I think, Victoria's chapter really focuses on these attempts by a bureaucratic organization to engage in mass education, linking up these individual stories with larger social conflicts. So I appreciate that viewpoint that you brought, Monica.
Okay.
Other interventions?
Can I add something, Todd, to this discussion?
Sure.
I find this question very intriguing that Monica has just raised. I think I have this feeling, and I think Vlad shares this. I share this with Vlad. The idea that it's a form of social critique that is insofar specific as it is not only a form of ideology or theology or something ideational. It is a form of practice, actually. So at least in my understanding in these Asian cases that I looked at, the rhetorics and theological statements, more ideological statements, were always embedded in distinct forms of social practice. So the kinds of defensive agenda that these organizations, in my case, have, they want more than just get out a message towards, either the society, the more broader society out there, or towards the members, the own members of the organization. They really want to change social realities on the ground. And that is an integrated element of the defensive strategy that they had. And I'm wondering whether we can, when we define apologetics as a defense in word and deed, so as a more ideological / theological category, but at the same time also as a category of practice, whether this is something where we can see sort of a specific character for this particular form of social critique. It doesn't mean that other forms of social critique do not entail facets of or dimensions of practice. But in my interpretation here, this is organic, this practical dimension. So I think, especially in a context like decolonization, where so much is at stake here, it's really about everything in society. It's about existing power relations, social structures, about politics, about the ideology of nation building, how to define a nation. So this is pretty much about everything that is out there. And in that context, I think a defensive strategy from religious organizations necessarily entails elements of practice. So, and this is, I think, for me, a defining criteria of this particular form of social critique. And in that direction, I think I would move in that direction would I have the agenda to work this out in a more systematic way, as Monica has suggested. And I'm once again, I'm very intrigued by this, by her question.
Yeah, thank you. Victoria, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just thinking about my own, I guess, trajectory with this category of apologetics, and reflecting on some of the comments that have been made. I think one of the puzzles for me, and I'm not sure that I've kind of sorted it yet, but is this kind of relationship between apologetics and power. And one of the questions I remember early on having for Todd was, what really is the difference between apologetics and propaganda? And kind of how do we, what makes this distinct from, from that form of communication and that kind of activity? And I think the Soviet case really kind of forced this for me because, this is, when you have a power structure that has a monopoly on the field, right? We talk about apologetic fields, right? Then, who are you even defending the faith from? I mean, there's kind of, ostensibly you already have the monopoly. So there's this kind of, but yet you still engage in this struggle, against this kind of, in a way, like a construct of your own imagination, in the Soviet case, religion, right? This kind of, so I think this kind of issue of defensive versus offensive struggle is interesting to think about, and just kind of, defending the faith versus kind of propagating the faith, and if there's a distinction there that we can kind of think about. So that's, yeah, I mean, as I said, it's not a kind of fully formed argument. It's just more kind of thinking about why I had so many challenges applying this category within the Soviet context initially. And it was because of the kind of the field, and this kind of monopoly on the field, and the power struggle being really one that was already predetermined in many ways. So, yeah.
Well, the apologetic struggles seem to open up on some differential, right? Either it's different factions of a single religion, between religions, or between secular and religious. And so it seems that always constant is this missionizing effort across the differential, right? To try to, convince, but also spiritually transform the boundary and the people on the other side of the boundary. That seems to be a common element that we're finding. Vlad, did you raise your hand, or was it? No, okay, I saw something. Anyone else? No? Did you, you turned your mic on though, Vlad?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Clement said it very nicely. I started from the beginning kind of struggling to articulate this point about seeing apologetics as a form of practice and situating them within the whole colonial project, in the way British missionaries and established this educational system that afterwards Syrian Christians appropriated and used to fight back against them, but also to reform their own people. So, and I think there is a great value in pursuing this further. Also because I see, at least education remains a field of struggle today everywhere, from Europe to the States and elsewhere, between religious and secular forces. So at least you have some constancy here, and you can think you can think that it's not just limited to a particular time and space. So.
And I mean, I liked Clemence's emphasis on the word and deed, the interaction of those two elements, because I think in my chapter, I was very interested in the utility of the apologetics approach for doing intellectual history, or history of concepts and ideas. because I think that, there's often a lot of there's creativity that goes on in that practice that Clemens was talking about. That in the engagement on the front, people are constantly borrowing and trying out ideas, coming up with new concepts. And, we find that very strong, I think, in, if you look at church history, the apologists are often very inventive theologians. I see Amr Riyad appeared. Hello, Amr.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm so sorry I'm a bit late.
That's okay. We're I think towards the end of wrapping up our discussion. We're just talking now about the, we heard from some of the parts of the book, and now people are just thinking collectively about the utility of this concept. Did you want to add anything, Amr?
No, it is actually from my part. I mean, the chapter just was dealing with these historical episodes between Europe and the Muslim world, and how British Muslims played this role and wrote apologies for Islam from between their being British and being Muslims, and the question of loyalty was always discredited. They were seen as enemies from within, as many people called them at this time. And therefore, they were just like, they were trapped between their new belief, the question of political loyalty, their former religion. So there were many interesting aspects to add to the question of apologetics. When we are talking about apologetics, this is what I have noted. I mean, just like, in Islamic literature, it's always about Muslim-Christian apologetics, but how Muslims themselves also developed ideas from within, and these converts were also their loyalty was also questions among Muslims themselves. So it's not only that their European peers discredited their new affiliation, but some Muslims were also hesitant to accept their full faith in Islam.
Great, thank you. Well, any other final comments anyone would like to make? Hugh, do you want to say anything? Or?
No, I don't think I'll add anything apart from apologising for arriving late because of problems in sort of following the link. So I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay. Well, I mean, thank you everyone for coming today. Thanks to all the contributors for helping us put together what I think is a wonderful book. Yeah, I look forward to collaborating with you all in the future.
Yes, can I thank the whole team as well, please? I don't know if there's many of them left here, but particularly the ones who are still here. So.
Yeah, okay. Well,
particularly Todd, who after all was the person who set the whole thing in motion.
Thanks, with also Benjamin, not to be forgotten.
Benjamin as well, that's right. It was really Todd and Benjamin who started it all off. And then I jumped on the bandwagon when it was well in motion.
Yeah, thank you, Hugh.
No, thank you, Paul. I mean, your editing was really marvelous. I mean, just like, it kept us critical. To think critically, really. It's really, I have enjoyed it and learned a lot from your feedbacks. Because it's just actually when you are in your discipline, you think that everybody understands you, but once you get out of your box, out of your tunnel vision, then you notice that you should be more clearer than you think.
Good advice. Okay, well, thank you all. Enjoy the Biden inauguration. Hopefully, there's not a coup d'état before the end of the day. Okay.
Thank you again, Todd.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.